about you, but for myself, there's some ways that I often look for answers. There's people I go to look for some answers. The number one being Google. If I don't know something or if I need something, Google is usually the first place I go to. If it's a medical condition, I go to the worst place possible, WebMD. I have a sore and it ends up me dying. That is usually what happens with WebMD, but that's where I go to for answers. Dr. Phil, Dr. Oz, Siri. We have these things, these people, these places we go to looking for answers. Some of you have come here today looking for answers. I told you last week that we were going to talk today about how do we respond or what do we do when it seems like God isn't cooperating? What do we do when it feels like God has pushed the mute button, right? And we're talking and we just don't hear anything back. We don't hear the answers that we want. He doesn't seem to move towards us or in our direction. What do we do? And so I think many of you came today waiting for answers, looking for answers. But I don't have all the answers. Some of you already know that, and that's not that disappointing to you. But I don't know everything. Just because I have the title of pastor doesn't mean I know everything about God. I don't. I don't know why God sometimes doesn't answer prayers. I don't know why sometimes in my life I've cried out to God and I've struggled and I've prayed for things for years. Some of you have done that. Some of you can think of things you've prayed for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it feels like God isn't cooperating with what you're wanting him to do. And I think we've all gotten to a point, no matter where you are spiritually, no matter where you would say you fit on the spectrum of your spiritual life, maybe you believe, maybe you don't believe, maybe your prayers have been to whom it may concern, right? You're just throwing something up, hoping for something. But I think all of us have gotten to a point at one point where we have said, God, why don't you do something about that? Why don't you do something about that? Now that could be lots of different things. That could be sitting close to you, and you may have wondered, why has God not done anything with that in our life, in our marriage, and with my kids? Maybe some of you have a prodigal child, meaning you have a child that has walked away from the faith. They've rebelled, and you've prayed over and over, and it just feels like God's not doing anything about that. Maybe it's a sickness you have. Maybe it's bad results from a test, and you've prayed over and over that God would heal you, and you're not seeing that. You've wondered, God, why don't you just do something about that? Like, I've heard you're all powerful, and I've heard you're good, and I've heard you can do all things. Why don't you just do something about that? We get a sense that maybe he's not. Maybe you don't have a job. Maybe you have a job or 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and it feels like you can just never pay the bills. You can never get ahead, and you just ask God, why can't you do something about that? Or we look around on a global scale, and we say, okay, why doesn't God do something about hunger around our country and around our world? Or there's kids dying because they don't have clean water. Why doesn't God just do something about that? We've asked those questions. Right now, I'm asking why God can't make San Francisco Giants lose a game and the Cardinals win so we can get into the playoffs, right? We're praying for that today. I don't know if it's going to happen. Why won't God do something about that? Right? So why, in the midst of all of these things, and all of these things, whatever your that is, why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't he do something? Maybe you feel like God's not listening or not cooperating very well. Why won't he just do what we've asked him to do? And there's a couple things that make this even more difficult, is because we look around and we see people where it seems like God is doing things for people. Right? We see people around us who seem to be living maybe not the best life that we would think of, and they're making poor choices, but then we look at their life and it's like, man, God's taking care of them. Everything seems to always work out for them. Why can't it work out for me? And so specifically, if you're a follower of Jesus and you've prayed for certain things to happen and they're not happening, seems like the ears of God have been shut off to you, we begin to do a few things. One of the main ones is we begin to ask or question how God feels about us. God, don't you love me? Do you care for me? Aren't you going to take care of me? We wonder if we're praying right. Did I say the wrong words? Did I say it the wrong way? Am I not doing it the correct way? Is that why God is not responding? And then often what happens is we just stop asking. We just kind of give up and move on and say, all right, well, I guess God's not going to do anything on our behalf. And if that's not enough, I think there have been some people, specifically people in my position, who have the title of pastor, who have said some really dumb things. You may have sat in a church and you may have been struggling, and there's been someone who has stood up and they have said things like, well, why don't you just have more faith? I don't know if that's ever been told to you. I don't know if you've ever felt that. You've been praying and nothing's happening, and someone said, well, why don't you just believe more? Or why don't you have more obedience? Maybe if you're more obedient, then God would respond. Or just pray harder or pray more. You must be doing something wrong. And so we begin to question, are we not doing it right? How does God feel about us? I've sat in places, even over the last year and a half as I've visited other churches, where even when it comes to a time of giving, or my thing that I can't usually get away from is watching late night televangelists, and it's like a bad addiction. And so I watch these late night evangelists who talk about sowing your seed. If you would just give more money, right, then God will bless you and God will take care of you. Or you hear someone pray about something that seems so insignificant. Right? You see someone post, I was in the parking lot at the mall and it was busy and I prayed for a close parking place and God gave it to me. Right? And you're thinking, what? I'm praying for real things and God's not answering those real prayers. Now, let me just say this. You're not going to hear those things from me today. I'm not going to try and give you any easy answers. I'm not going to try and give you a formula. I don't think there's any formula to figuring this out. I'm a runner. I ran this morning, and as I was getting ready for the race, and I was interacting with some people, and I overheard what people were talking about. Many of them started talking about their routine. The routine that they have, or they followed a formula to get where they're at. There's lots of things that you can do right to run as fast as you want to do. And so if you follow the right formula and you do the right thing, then normally you'll get the response that you want. But that's not true with prayer. I don't think there's just a box you check or a formula you go through, and then if you do it the right way, then God responds. And so I'm not going to give you a formula. Prayer can be hard. It can be hard. And for many of you, you've struggled and you've dealt with this for a long time. And it feels like God can be on mute. Now, let me encourage you a little bit. There's a part of the Bible called the Psalms. This is really, when it was written, Israel's songbook. So these guys, these men wrote these prayers, these songs, and then groups of people would sing them. They would pray them. And oftentimes, if you're like me, we know these psalms, or maybe someone has given you a psalm to go and look at, and it was encouraging and uplifting. But I want to let you know that that's not the whole story of Psalms. About a third of the Psalms are called Psalms of Lament. And I was trying to figure out a way to explain this last night, and my wife is usually a good person to kind of bounce ideas off of, and so I said, I want to say something tomorrow, and can you tell me if I should or not? And so I told her, and she was like, yeah, you probably shouldn't say that. And she was like, what are you talking about? And so I explained. She goes, yeah, I don't really know how else to say it. And so I'm gonna say something. Okay, so be prepared, be ready. Okay, it's not that bad. All right, it's PG rated. The Psalms of Lament are really just these psalms where it basically says, it sucks to be me. Sucks to be me. And many of the times they're personal laments. So it's these, my life is not going well. God, what's going on? Or it's these community prayers, these community laments. It sucks to be us. And these were, about a third of the Psalms are these Psalms of lament. And so I just want to read a couple to you. These aren't going to be up on the screen or anything. But Psalm 13, just listen to this. I don't know if you know this is in the Bible, all right? But listen to the way this author, the writer of this, is speaking to God. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. 20 times in the Psalms do you hear this, how long, O Lord? How long, God? How long am I going to have to pray this prayer over and over? When will you hear me? When will you listen to me? Now, most of the laments makes a turn at some point. So you may have caught it there at the end. So he gives this lament, this really, it's this complaining or whining to God. And then it turns, and you may have heard it at the end, but I'll trust. I'll trust in you even in the midst of all this. But that's not true for all Psalms. Psalm 88, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just listen to a few parts of this. Psalm 88, verse 6, it says, "You have put me in the lower pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily upon me. You have overwhelmed me with your waves. You have taken me from my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief." And then this is how this one ends. "You have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend." And he ends. There is no turn. And so we have to begin to understand that there's times where we cry out to God, "God, are you listening? How long am I going to have to pray for this, God? When will you hear me? When will you deliver me? When will you rescue me?" And I think many of us are afraid to pray that way. I think we're afraid to pray that way. And if you know the Bible, I believe, that everything in the Bible is there for a reason. Right? It's not by mistake. There were times where someone could have read that and thought, that probably shouldn't be in there. Right? That may not be encouraging to people. And through God's grace and through his provision, it's in there. And I think it's in there for a reason. And I think when we pray those prayers, we begin to do, as I said earlier, we question things. If I pray that way, then how is God going to look at me? How does God think of me when I struggle and I doubt and I don't understand? And so as I got into this, I had planned on just speaking one Sunday about this, and I thought, man, I feel like I'm going to fail if I only spend one Sunday talking about this. And so we're going to spend 2 weeks talking about this. And then the last week, we're going to look at the idea of, well, how does Jesus teach us to pray? And it's going to kind of go back and look at a lot of things that we've talked about. And we want to pray like Jesus prayed. And so this week, we're going to look at one guy's story, one guy's life, and then next week, we'll pick up and we'll look at another one. And so the first guy we're going to look at is a guy named John the Baptist. John the Baptist. It's going to be in Luke 7, so if you have a Bible, you can turn there. If you don't own a Bible, there should be a red one around you. That's our gift to you. You can have that Bible. It'll also be on the screen. But as we start, I think it's important for you to know who John the Baptist is. John the Baptist was a cousin of Jesus, so he's a relative of Jesus. John the Baptist was going out and he was preaching about Jesus. He was pointing to him and saying, hey, look, Jesus is coming. The one that we have been waiting for is on his way. He is the Messiah, the one who will save us. He at one point sees Jesus walking by and he says, look, the Lamb of God, the one who takes away the sin of the world. This is who John is. John actually baptizes Jesus. So he was an important person in the history of the scriptures, in the history of our faith. This is who he is. Now, John ends up in prison under the rule of a guy named King Herod. King Herod is actually the guy who was killing all the babies when Jesus is being born, trying to eliminate Jesus. King Herod was not a good man. He was a bad man. Emperor Augustus, so not in the Bible, he said this about King Herod: "It is better to be Herod's swine than his son." He was a Jewish man, so he wouldn't eat pork. So the author of this is saying it's better to be his pig than to be related to King Herod. And so this is where John the Baptist finds himself, in prison to King Herod. Now, King Herod didn't like John the Baptist because John the Baptist was calling him out on some of his decisions and how he was living life, and so he imprisons him. And this is where we find John the Baptist in this story, Luke 7:18. Now, just before this, let me say this. Jesus has just healed a man. He's healed a boy, actually, and he's actually walking into a community. A widow, a single mom is walking out with the coffin of this little boy, and Jesus touches the coffin, and the boy sits up, and he brings this boy back to life. Verse 18. It says, John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling 2 of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" Now remember, John had just spent time telling everyone else who Jesus is. And now John finds himself in prison, probably feels forgotten. He hears about the healings of Jesus, and he calls his disciples John had disciples, learners. He calls them and says, hey, you need to go ask Jesus something for me. Would you just go ask him if he's the one? Is he the one, or should I be looking for someone else? John has heard that people are being healed. He's out saving others, but he's not doing anything for John, his cousin, the one who has pointed to him. And he wants Jesus to hear him ask the question, are you the one? Are you the one? You could say that John has probably hit the lowest of lows. He's probably thinking he's days away from dying. He's never going to escape this jail cell. Now, can you imagine the disciples' response? Well, hold on, John. Are you sure you want us to go ask Jesus this question? Yeah, I need you to go ask Jesus. Are you the one, or should we be looking for someone else? Now, this is what's happening, and this is what's happening to most of us when we go through difficult times. When it feels like God is not cooperating, or it feels like he has been put on mute. And that's when our circumstances change. What we believe about God starts to change. When our circumstances look different, when they begin to change, we begin to question. We begin to question who God is. And the view of God begins to change for us. I've done this in my life. Okay, God, are you going to come through for me on this one? I hear people talk about you, God, as a good father. Are you going to do anything for me on this one? Are you going to fix that problem? Are you going to heal that sickness, whether it's myself or someone else? I have friends who can't pay the bills. God, are you going to do something for them? Circumstances change, and how we view God begins to change. A pastor's name's Andy Stanley, leads a church down in Atlanta. He says this, isn't it interesting when you go through a hard time, I pray. So you come to me and you tell me your difficulties, and my response is, I'll pray for you. But when we go through a hard time, when I go through a hard time, I doubt. If it's you, I pray. If it's me, I doubt and I question, and how I view God begins to change. Now, this is what happens in the nature of pain. It causes us to sink down into the pit. When we're experiencing pain, it causes us to see the world in a very small way. Sometimes it's hard to see what else is going on around us, and our world becomes very small. And John's world has become very small. He only knows and he only sees what's in the midst of his prison cell. And so the disciples go to Jesus, verse 20. It says, when the man came to Jesus, they said, John the Baptist sent us to ask you, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? I'm guessing the disciples kind of, okay, this isn't our question, Jesus. John, your cousin who's in prison, he wants to know, are you the one? Are you the one, or should he be looking for someone else? Now, here's what Jesus doesn't do. Jesus doesn't respond by saying, man, John must have no faith. He doesn't respond by saying, just go tell him to believe more. He doesn't go and tell John, well, there must be some sin in John's life that he needs to get rid of. He doesn't do any of that. This is what Jesus says, and what I think he's saying to you and to me in the midst of our times where we feel like God's not cooperating, when he's inattentive, when he's on mute. Verse 21. At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Listen, go back and tell John everything that you've seen and heard, because where John is at in his prison cell, he can't hear anything. In the midst of his feeling defeated, in the midst of his pain, he's unable to hear, he's unable to see what's going on around him. And so you go tell John. You be his ears, you be his eyes, you go tell him what is happening. Go tell him what I'm doing. So just like you and just like me, just like John, we get to these points where it's hard for us to see that God is still doing anything around us. We begin to wonder and to question the faithfulness of God and the realness of God. And so Jesus says, just go remind him. Go remind John everything that's happening, because John's just hearing the words of King Herod. He's only seeing the walls of his prison cell. He can see and hear nothing else. What he sees and hears has become his personal reality, even though it's not the reality of who God is. When you go through things, when you're struggling, it becomes your personal reality. This is what life is, but it does not change who God is. And so how do the miracles of faith impact your life? When things go well around you for other people, what happens to your spirit? What happens to your faith? What happens to your life? Here's what I think normally happens. One is we become jealous or envious. Why is that not happening for me? God, do you know that person? Do you know what they've been doing? How are you going to bless them? How are you going to take care of them? And so we become jealous or envious, or we worship God. We worship God and we think, man, God, you are still doing great things. The other thing that sticks out to me in this is sometimes our faith is not very, very strong. Sometimes we feel like we don't have much to give to God. We question and we doubt. And this is where I think it's vital for us to be in a community of people. This is where I think it's vital for you to understand that your faith in God is not simply about you, but it's about being in community. It's about being with other people. And so it's almost like Jesus is saying, look, go back to John and be with John. The faith that you have, the faith that's growing because of what you're seeing, go and carry John through this. We're better together. We're better together. And so many of us know our friends, we know family who are going through difficult things. And they may have little to no faith. There's a story at one point where a man is paralyzed, and so his friends take them to Jesus. They literally rip the roof off of this house because they can't get into Jesus. They have this massive amount of faith that Jesus is going to heal their friend. It never really talks about the faith of the guy who's paralyzed. But their friends have this massive amount of faith, and he can't get to Jesus, and so they carry Jesus up on top of a roof. They tear the roof apart, and they lower him down to Jesus, and Jesus heals him. And he actually says, it's because of your faith. Now, this is what I find interesting. I don't honestly know whose faith he's talking about. I don't know whose faith he's talking about. And I've seen in my own life that there's times where I've had little faith, but the people around me have had massive amounts of faith. And they've carried me through difficult days. And so some of you have walked through difficult things, and you've walked through them by yourself. You don't have to walk through those by yourself. There's a community of people who love you and care for you. And so it's about figuring out how we can do that together. And that you can ask people, look, I don't know if I can pray right now. Can you pray for me? I have people who I know I'm on their prayer chain. I know I'm on their prayer list. They're praying for me often, and some things in my life where I've begun to slow in my prayers because God just hasn't answered them. But there's other people who are carrying me through that, and it's almost as if Jesus sends these guys back to John to help him get through these days. And then it's almost as if they're walking away, that then Jesus says this, like that was probably good and enough, but then this is what Jesus says, verse 23. He says, blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. Now, what is Jesus saying here? The disciples, I wonder if they would have said, so you know what John's going through? Jesus said, yeah. And you're not going to do anything about it. Jesus says, no. Hold on. Don't you love John? I mean, he's your cousin. Like, did something happen growing up? Was there a rift? I remember a cousin that I had that used to bully and pick on me, and my mom, being my loving mom, told me not to let that happen anymore and to punch him in his nose if he does it again. There's 2 times I've hit people, and both of them were my mom's fault. My mom's listening, sorry. But I remember him. So my cousin and I have had problems growing up. So Jesus, did you have something happen with John? Do you not like John? So you begin to wonder, no. Just go tell John, blessed is the one who does not fall away on account of me. Blessed is the one who doesn't fall away because every prayer isn't answered. Blessed is the one who continues to fight and to struggle and to pray even when it feels like God is not cooperating or we feel like he's been put on mute. Blessed is that person that holds on and doesn't lose faith in the midst of those things. Now, this is what I want you to hear today, and I've really struggled on what to talk about, and because we could go lots of different directions as we talk about God not answering our prayers. But I honestly think one of the most dangerous things we can do is begin to question how God sees us. No matter what the situation or circumstance, one of the most dangerous things we can do is to question our identity in what God says about us. When Jesus is tempted in the desert, this is how the enemy even tempts Jesus. If you are the Son of God, right? He begins to challenge Jesus in what his identity is as the Son of God. One of the things that will ruin you and ruin me is when we begin to question our identity as a child or a son or a daughter of the King of the universe, of the one who has created everything. And that's often what happens when our prayers go unanswered. And so listen to this. This is what John, this is the words that are said about John by Jesus, verse 28. I tell you, among those born of women, which I think is everyone, I tell you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. On the list of those who are the greatest, Jesus puts John at the top of the list. But yet he's not going to get him out. He's not going to rescue him. Blessed is the one who does not fall away on account of me, Jesus says. When prayers go unanswered, when you don't hear from God, blessed are you when you hold on to faith. Now, what does this have to do with us? How do we respond? Just really quickly, I want to talk through just a few things. Number one, remember what God has done. One of the most important things we can do in the midst of not hearing from God is to be able to look back in our own life or someone else's and remember what God has done on our behalf. Many people, much smarter than me, many scholars, they talk about how there's no prayers that go unanswered. Just the answer may not be what we want. It might be a no when we want a yes. It may be a not now when we need it now. But no prayers go unanswered. And so we can look back and we can think, all right, God has saved me in that situation, or he's not answered that prayer, and am I thankful that he didn't answer that prayer? My freshman year in high school, I had dated a girl for 3 years. Freshman year in college, I had dated a girl for 3 years. Through high school and into my freshman year, thought I loved her, thought we were going to get married, and things began to be difficult. And I can remember praying over and over, God, would you fix this? Would you help this work out? Would you change her? Would you help us get through this time? And then I remember one day all right, God, I guess you're not going to do anything. And I broke up with her. One of the hardest things I'd ever done. Again, I thought my future was with this girl. And then about a week later, this beautiful girl on campus sends this guy to tell me that she likes me. And now, 17 years later, she's my wife. And this was a week after I had experienced maybe one of the worst moments, what I thought was one of the worst moments of my life. I don't know what life would have looked like if God would have answered the other prayer. Maybe things would have been fine and maybe things would have worked out, but I know the no then was a great yes to something later. And so I can look back and think, all right, God, you may be saying no now, but I'm going to trust. You've been faithful in the past. I'm going to believe that you'll be faithful in the future. Remember that God has promised not to forsake us. He has promised not to abandon us. He has promised his presence, not necessarily his presence, not just his things, but we get God, and that has to be enough. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you, his presence. He will never leave you nor forsake you. He will not abandon you in the midst of what you are going through. The third thing, understand that your current conditions don't necessarily coincide with how God feels about you. I've said that. Hopefully you've heard me say that. Let me say that again. Understand that your current conditions doesn't necessarily coincide with how God feels about you. We hear Jesus say, John is the greatest ever to be born of women. And he doesn't go and rescue him. He doesn't get him out. And then maybe the most important thing, the proof of how God feels about you happened on a cross, not in certain prayers that are answered or not answered. The way God feels about you is shown up when Jesus goes to a cross and he gives his son's life for you and for me. While we were yet sinners, while we were still broken people, Christ dies for us because he loves us. God so loved the world that he gave his only son to you, to me. That is proof of how God feels about you. Not just when God doesn't answer certain prayers. And it doesn't end well for John the Baptist. Not long after this, King Herod is celebrating a birthday. A young girl comes in and dances. He's well pleased by this and gives an oath, whatever you want, I'll give to you. She goes back and asks her mom, and her mom says, I want John the Baptist's head on a platter. And that's what happens to John the Baptist's life. It does not go well. And we hear Jesus in the last days of his life even ask his Father, is there another way? God, is there another way? He feels this pressure. We talked about a few weeks ago where he's sweating blood, a true medical condition. He's in this massive amount of pain, and it does not end well for Jesus either, as he's brutally beaten and he dies a murderer's death on a cross. It doesn't go well. But the proof of God's love for you is in the midst of that, in the midst of what Jesus goes through. And then don't be afraid to lament. Don't be afraid to cry out to God and say, God, are you going to do something? But my hope is, like many of the Psalms of lament, is there's a turn for you. God, even if it doesn't, I'm going to trust you. Even if it doesn't, I'm not going to question your faith, for your faithfulness or your love for me. I'm going to cry out, but I'm going to make the turn in my own life. Next week, we're going to look at Paul's life. We talk a lot about Paul, but there's a moment where Paul makes a pretty significant request, and we hear God say no to Paul. So there's times where God seems to be distant and uncooperative, and then there's times where we feel like God is saying no to us. How do we make it through those times? Would you pray with me? God, for many of us, we've spent a lot of our life asking how long? How long, God, before you change the heart of our spouse? How long, oh God, before you change the heart of our children? How long, oh God, before you change our neighborhood, our community? How long, oh God, before you provide or you heal? But God, on behalf of my friends and the amount of faith that I have, will trust in you. In the midst of lamenting, of whining, of complaining, when it feels like we hear nothing from you. God, would you help us to have the strength to hold on? To hold on. God, more importantly, would my friends here understand how you see them? That you know each one of them, you care deeply for them, that they've all been created in your image. Would you help us to live into that, even when prayers go unanswered? Would we not question how you feel about us, God? God, would you help us as we continue to battle and to struggle and to pray for the things that we care deeply about? Would you give us enough faith to keep doing that? We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. See you next week. Love you guys.